to Shakespeare Scene by Scene, Macbeth. Hello folks, and thank you for joining Kamran, Abbassian, and
Whelan.
here working on the play Macbeth.
We're going to go scene by scene through this play, so I hope you're ready for some illuminating discussion.
So, for those of you who don't know, Steve was actually my high school theater teacher, one of the most impressionable teachers I've ever had. He's worked on Macbeth as well, so I guess I'd ask you straight up what you got out of performing Macbeth.
So I was able to do 30 performances of Macbeth back in the day. It was in a very small theater, but it was a great experience because I got to work on the play for a year. It started first as a project in an acting class, and it led to a full production in a very small theater in like kind of like LA 99 seat theater, equity waiver. So
Yeah, I mean, it's a play that he brings up a lot when we work on Shakespeare, or when I worked on Shakespeare in high school.
And when Kamran was in high school, he did a couple of festivals at the Chapman University Shakespeare Festival, where we actually did Macbeth one of the years, and he won Best Actor at the festival for playing the bleeding captain in Scene 2 in Act 1. So,
Yeah, so it's a play that we both have a relationship with, and for those of you who've worked on Shakespeare before or studied it, you understand that it's something that just grows and grows throughout the years. So here we find ourselves in the middle of these pandemic times, and the play visits my mind again. And so I'm sitting here with Steve, and we're going to go scene by scene. Some of you might not know this play very well, and you'll be able to get a firsthand account of what this story that Shakespeare wrote is. Others who know the play will be able to compare notes with us as to how you feel about some of the interpretations that we have as we go scene by scene.
So hopefully this will be something for everyone. You know, I know Shakespeare's not for everyone, but if you're studying Macbeth in a high school or college class, hopefully it'd be good for that. If you're an actor and you just like to talk about theater, hopefully this is for you as well. And if you're a lay person that really enjoys Shakespeare or doesn't know Shakespeare at all, we hope all of this is for all of you.
So Steve, going into this, Macbeth is a tragedy. It's called The Tragedy of Macbeth, correct?
Yes, it is.
So could you identify for us what a tragedy is?
Well, tragedy goes back to it actually comes from two words, goat song, which is Greek, and it represented the goat because of Dionysus.
So like the satyrs and all that?
The goat was a symbol of Dionysus, and theater was created in the name of Dionysus, and so tragedy has the roots of those two words in it somehow, goat song. Ode, of course, is a big part of, tragedy, because there's Ode 1, Ode 2, Ode 3, and they're all different parts of the chorus. And Shakespeare in this play doesn't necessarily have a chorus. Maybe the witches are a chorus. But he definitely models his plays after the Greek model, which Aristotle wrote about in the essay that he wrote called The Poetics. And he talks about, for a tragedy to exist, the protagonist has to have three characteristics. The first one is that he's naturally good, he or she is naturally good. Number two, of royal birth. And number three, has some sort of flaw in his or her character that keeps them from, achieving maybe their goals or their happiness or whatever. It gets in the way of their quest,
So as far as this being a Greek structure that Shakespeare's borrowing from or using, he's taking out the physical conventions like the chorus and probably some other elements too, like only a few characters being at stage at once, violence happening off stage, things like that. So he's just keeping it at the core of character itself and using that as the guiding light.
Yeah, and of course Shakespeare was roundly criticized for not sticking to other elements of tragedy, which is the unities of time, place, and action. Because in Greek plays, the chorus sometimes acts as a little bit of passage of time in between the scenes, and there's usually 5 scenes. So Shakespeare has a 5-act structure. He certainly has more than 5 scenes in his plays. But so in that way, he kind of follows it. But this idea of the sun rising at the beginning of the play and the sun setting at the end of the play, unities of time, place, and action, that everything in the play takes place within one day.
Like Dog Day Afternoon.
Yeah, and the only change or challenge or change of time is the chorus in between the scenes, like I said. Now, the neoclassicists really hated Shakespeare because they felt he was horrible at sticking to.
And who are the
unities.
neoclassicists?
I think it was the French after Shakespeare died. Richelieu and all the Louis XIV and his whole train of writers that were very prolific during the 17th century. Because if you read a French play, even a comedy like Tartuffe, they have the French scenes, as they call them. One scene goes into the next, into the next, into the next, and it's all in real time. Yeah. And there's no cutting. And of course, in Hamlet, famously, Hamlet plays a joke on the audience where Act 1 ends, Act 2 begins, and you think it's the very next scene, and it's actually 2 months later. So he might have just been messing with people when it came to time. But I feel like he didn't want to be bogged down by having to stick to Aristotelian time. So I know that gets a little bit flowery there.
Well, I feel like there's periods in people's lives that might be months and months and months that feel like one day. If you're going through like a court settlement or a divorce or anything like that takes an extended period of time, I could see how in an Aristotelian structure you can make that all feel like one day.
Sure.
And I feel like Shakespeare does that all the time.
And of course, in all great tragedies, there's the idea the character has this big reversal that occurs, and there's also the tragic recognition where they realize what they've done, and they either they choose to completely repent from the act that they've done, or they go further into it. And we'll definitely see that as part of Macbeth, right?
And speaking of that, we always go back and forth about this, that you don't necessarily think that Macbeth is a traditional protagonist of a tragedy by the standards that we're talking about here. Why do you think that is?
And I would think anybody listening to our little program here, might have a little bit of background in Shakespeare. So I don't think it's necessarily spoiling the plot when I say, well, Macbeth makes some decisions very early in the play that have to do with, evil. He goes to the dark side, and that gets kind of tricky when you're trying to root for the character, when the main word in protagonist is or it's at least the prefix. You're rooting for the person. And so how do you root for someone who's evil? How do you root for someone that's, truly a villain? Except for the fact that maybe we see ourselves in the actions that Macbeth plays, and we say, oh, wow, I've been at that crossroads, kind of like Robert Johnson and, that song Crossroads where the blues singer.
No, is that about being at the
he's at the crossroads, and he can go either to the dark side with the devil or, resist it, and he chooses to go with the devil.
Is that the guy who could shred and they thought
Robert
he got
Johnson.
It from the devil?
Robert Johnson, one of the great
that's right.
Delta blues singers and guitar players.
Well, he's a lot like Macbeth in that way.
If in that song is true, yeah.
Well, so you're essentially saying that even though these protagonists of tragedies could have flaws, Macbeth steeps in so far to the point where wait, this isn't no redeemable guy would go this far as the standard that we have for watching drama.
Yeah, there's something similar in one of Shakespeare's histories in Richard II. Here's a guy that chooses to become king because it kind of presents himself, and he knows that maybe it goes against.
Do you mean Richard III?
Did I?
Oh, you said the second.
No, I mean Richard II. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm talking about Bolingbroke.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about the Hunchback's
Bolingbroke decides, well, hey, I'm going to come back and get kind of revenge by getting my property back and things, but then he sees an opportunity to become king and he takes it. And I think he knows that it goes against the will of God, because that's what they believed, and I think some people still to this day believe that God puts people in power, especially when it comes to monarchies, and they are inspired of God, and to kill a king is just a horrendous crime. Mm-hmm. And I think in real life he supposedly suffered from that decision that he made, is deposing Richard II and becoming king himself, and that it kind of haunted him his whole life. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think it was one of the reasons why he went on the Crusades.
That's right. Yeah, we've talked about
this. To repent, yeah.
Yeah, pretty common with leaders, right? That you go to the Middle East when you want to make a name for yourself. All that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to be able to explore a lot of these ifs and buts about how Macbeth functions as a character and his story in general. And folks, I hope you're along for the journey, and we appreciate you coming along with us. So sit back, relax, and listen to us yap about Macbeth for a bit. Act 1, Scene 1.
It's described as a desert place, and the stage direction says, thunder and lightning enter 3 witches, who are also known as the Weird Sisters. And the word weird was probably a Shakespeare word that he invented. And it's based on the word
wayward,
which is what?
It's a conjunction. Oh, it means like an outside place, or
or
outlandish, or off.
Yeah, just off kilter, off base, off target.
Mm-hmm.
I guess in a way. The witches there's 3 of them, as we know, and I'm just going to read the opening scene and then we're going to discuss it. It's the shortest scene in the play, so it won't take long. First witch, second witch, third witch. When shall we 3 meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, that will be ere the set of sun, where the place upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. I come, grey Malkin, paddock calls, anon. Fair is foul and foul is fair.
Hover through the fog and filthy air.
And then it says exunt, which is Latin for more than one person exiting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay, so everybody exits. And they basically say, hey, where we're going to meet? We're going to meet when the battle's lost and won, when the hurly-burly's done. And what's hurly-burly?
It means like a tumult, a conflict that's messy.
Yeah, chaos, tumult, yes. And what is it that's tumultuous right now? What's happening in Scotland these days?
There's actually a war going on, a civil war.
And
a battle.
A foreign invasion.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot going on in Scotland these days. And the witches are probably celebrating this idea of death and destruction and war.
Maybe they're the cause of it for all we know. That's a big question with this play, is how responsible are these creatures for the events that unfold in this play?
Yeah, so great word, hurly-burly. And then there's another word that I love to always bring up, especially to my students when I teach Shakespeare. Third witch says that will be ere the set of sun. So she's saying that will happen before the sun sets, because ere, E-R-E, means before. Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked about how I feel like there's a lot of confusion when it comes to that word. And what is the phrase that people misuse a lot?
They confuse that with right?
Yeah,
Like to err.
To is human, not to err is human. You could say to error is human, but you can't say to err is human.
But couldn't you just say that's people mispronouncing it and not necessarily mixing up the definitions?
Do you know that we mispronounce lingerie?
Yeah, you say it's lingerie.
It's supposed to be lingerie. Yeah,
it just does not sound very French-like.
But hey, that's the actual pronunciation. So anyway, it's
very weird.
Pet peeve of mine, right? I like air to be pronounced correctly, and I like people to know what air means when they say it, which is before. So all these things are going to come down before the sun sets, and it's going to happen on the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. And why? I think there's supposed to be a rhyming couplet there. Now
Now, there's something called OP, original pronunciation. And in Shakespeare's age, the late Elizabethan era, early Jacobean, the English they spoke, the accent, the dialect that they used was referred to as original pronunciation. And we don't know too much about it. And honestly, what we do know about it, we understand through the rhyming couplets of Shakespeare and other contemporaries of his. And seeing the way that certain words like that rhyme would give us an idea, an approximation of what that dialect would be. So if Heath rhymes with Macbeth, then we could infer that maybe it's Macbeth. Maybe that's how they pronounce it.
Or it's possible that it's an approximate rhyme. You know, it doesn't necessarily fully rhyme, but the TH sound rhymes. So where the place upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth.
Like a type of alliteration that happens at the end of the word as opposed to the beginning?
Yeah, I always call it just an approximate rhyme.
Or I meant assonance.
Yeah, assonance.
Yeah, that's what
sounds
I meant.
good. Yeah, don't call me an assonance. Okay, so that has that in there. They're going to meet him on the heath, which I believe is like a big kind of open prairie-like area that they have a lot of heaths in Scotland. Kind of a blasted, unusable area, not good for farmland.
A place to rip on the bagpipes, you know?
Yeah. And then the first witch says, "I come, Grey Malkin," and then Paddock calls, says the second witch. And I kind of find that interesting because a Grey Malkin is a cat and a Paddock is a toad. What's going on with that?
They're answering to these creatures of the earth, so if they're witches, part of the lore of the witchcraft that Shakespeare's creating or that he's riffing off of in the time that he's writing in this period of history, they looked at witches as answering to nature in this sort of ungodly way. Maybe there's this relationship with nature as something that's carnal and against God or contrary to God.
And they call them familiar spirits or like demons, right? So here these witches are saying that they are answering to, a cat and to a toad. And then the third witch says anon, which means right away. Okay, we're going to listen to you and we're going to go follow whatever you're telling us to do. And then they break out into this wonderful alliteration of, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. Which brings us to our first paradox, which I think is one of the keys to this play. It's a play about equivocation. And there's a lot of equivocal remarks made, oftentimes in the form of a paradox. And oftentimes people know what paradox kind of means. They have a general idea, but paradox is kind of a statement that seems to be contradictory, but might have a smidgen or a level of truth to it. Like for a witch, foul is fair. Something that's bad and ugly is fair or beautiful.
One man's trash is another man's.
Yeah, and the opposite is true, that fair is foul, but foul also could be fair. So they're playing around early in the play with this idea of paradox.
Well, even before that, they say when the battle is lost and won. How could a battle be lost and won at the same time?
Absolutely, yes. So be ready to hear some discussion about equivocation at the beginning, throughout this play. I definitely think that later on we do mention the play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, which the heart of the play is about equivocation. And about the oracle at Delphi and how Oedipus and other characters in the story go for advice. And so the oracle at Delphi was where you would pose your question or your uncertainty or the big dilemma in your life. You would present it to a Pythian priestess. And she's called that because she's named after a python. Because supposedly under this little shrine, which is way up top of this 9,000-foot mountain in Greece, Delphi, are the remains of a python that Apollo had slain, many years before, and it's decaying, and the fumes are coming through the floorboard, And the Pythian priestess would breathe in the fumes and then make a psychic prediction for that person.
Yeah.
And so we cannot really lose sight of that being the source material for this play. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it also shows, too, how maybe truth is more than just facts themselves. Like, maybe objective facts are just a part of the equation, and then it's how you behave off of that. And that's where truth comes. And it isn't just empirical objectivity, you know?
Yeah, so the idea of prophecy is a big theme in here, as well as equivocation. And so many people, when they teach the play, I think they miss that part. Like, it's such a big part of the play, you know, that, well, we're going to find out the next time we see the witches, you know, how important equivocation is. And
I just wanted real fast to go over the verse in this scene, because typically Shakespeare writes in one way, but this scene is written in a different type of verse than he usually writes. So do you have anything that you wanted to say about that?
Well, so I would say at least a good 2/3 of the time Shakespeare's plays are written in verse, like a blank verse, a non-rhyming verse. But then other times he'll write in prose, which is just kind of a relaxed, more conversational speech, or speech that's based in somebody who's gone insane, or just, you know, kings and queens talking amongst themselves very casually, or talking down to somebody of lower class, right? So that's when you would see prose. But verse often comes in the form of iambic pentameter, that it's a 10-syllable line that has 5 unstressed syllables followed by 5 stressed syllables in a pattern of 2. So it's called an iamb. It has the pattern of da-dum, 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 da-dum. And it's called pentameter because penta means 5 and meter means meter. So 5 in the meter, pentameter. 5 iambs in the meter. And this is interesting because this is the opposite, which is called?
It's called trochaic tetrameter. So like in iamb, it goes off of 2 syllables as a unit, except the first syllable is stressed and the second is unstressed. And tetrameter meaning 4 stressed syllables. So where iambic is da-da, so unstressed, stressed, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, 5 of those, it's da-da, first one stressed, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, 4.
Yep, so it just kind of pops, and I think it's trying to show that they're witches from another world, and they speak differently than the other characters. And they speak in sing-songy kind of short lines, which kind of help create this idea that they're mystical and supernatural.
And it just seems like it goes and feeds so well into this theme of them turning the world upside down, saying something's fair and saying something's foul, and the other way around. And they're stressing weird words that Shakespeare usually never stresses in his verse, like articles and things like that, and a couple prepositions maybe. And
we're going to learn some more about them later in Act 1 and when we get to Scene 3.
All right, let's see what these guys are all about. Act 1, Scene 2.
A camp near Forres. It's in Scotland, so if we haven't covered that part of it, Scotland, as we know, is part of the British Isles, and it's the northern area, and a little bit to the east as well. And it says, alarm within, enter Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain, Lennox, with attendants meeting a bleeding sergeant. So there's this bleeding man that walks onto the stage where the king is. And unless we forget, or maybe we don't know at this point, Duncan is the king of Scotland. He has 2 sons, who we can assume are princes, Malcolm and Donalbain, and then Lennox is one of the lords or one of the thanes that we'll hear about later, and there's attendants. And in comes the king, and they talk about there's an alarum or alarum, it's usually pronounced alarum. It's like a Senate sound of probably trumpets, here to give warning that the king is coming. And it says within, and that probably refers to the actual original space that Shakespeare was writing and performing his plays for and in, the Old Globe, which has and you've been there, right?
Yeah,
you've seen it. So
well,
what is meant by within?
There's this house within the stage itself. There's the actual parapets where the actors stand on that make up the stage, and then upstage of that, there's this structure that looks like a cabin or a house that has a balcony on it, and set up center there's this double door that usually gets open, and that's used as a gate that people rush out of. And
is that the within we're talking about, that it's on the same level as the main part of the stage?
Yeah. I'd say so.
So it's just upstage of the main playing area.
So it's probably coming out of that double door as far as this stage direction is concerned.
Yeah, so when you see in Shakespeare's plays the original stage direction that he wrote, he'll refer to things like above or within or below. And those, believe it or not, those will be parts of the actual stage that he was working within, from 1599 until
1607.
Did it burn down? Did the old globe burn down during Shakespeare's life? I think it did. I'm forgetting my history. Sorry, friends, this is not a history lesson per se, but okay. So anyway, Duncan enters and he notices this bloody man, and he asks who he is, and that he could probably give us a good report about the current civil war that's happening, where Duncan is fighting for his country, and he has all these great warriors and things helping him. And then Malcolm says, "This is the sergeant that fought against my captivity." And he says, "Hail, brave friend, and tell the king, the knowledge of the war that, after you left it, like what was going on. We see you're bloody, so you were part of it. What happened? Mm-hmm. And what did happen?"
He goes into how he saw the battle as being this doubtful spectacle where he compares it to two swimmers that get tangled up and hold on to each other because they got cramped while they were racing, something like that. And I think what he's doing there is creating this visceral sensation of what it must have felt like in the battle. You see these depictions on Game of Thrones and maybe in Braveheart, some of those depictions where there's all these people heaped on top of each other. So when he says cling together and choke their art, I think what he's describing is there's this stockpile of people that are heaving themselves on top of each other and suffocating each other like some sort of a front row area at Coachella. It's
like a sea of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. And he basically says that the outcome of the war was in doubt. And that this person, the merciless MacDonald, who he calls is a rebel and full of villainy, he was supplied with kerns and gallows glasses, and those are what you would call Irish foot soldiers and Irish mercenaries, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in order for MacDonald to win the Civil War, he felt he had to hire some outside help. Yeah. And, if you've ever seen Braveheart, it always feels like the Irish are willing to lend a hand as long as there's money and probably some whiskey.
As long as they earn their pay.
But it looked like MacDonald was going to do well, and fortune was smiling on him like a rebel's whore. Mm-hmm. And that's very interesting. I guess it's hyperbole, but it's also personification. Like fortune, on his damned quarrel smiling, showed like a rebel's whore.
Luck be a lady.
Yeah. So who is fortune here? Sometimes fortune is spelled with a capital F, as in an actual person.
And it is in this case, right?
Well, is there a person named Fortune there on the battlefield with them?
No, but I think that when Shakespeare does that, it's actually a stage direction, or it's a direction for the actor of how to treat these concepts, because sometimes they are personified in these ways. And it's not in this case, but also at the Globe, they had these tableaus of all of these different gods on the sides of the walls. So if they did speak about Apollo, which they do sometimes they would play it out to the wall. And because this is a pre-Freudian way of performance where, you take these big ideas and you personify them. And so in the case of Fortune, turning it into this woman, it's for the sake of creating this metaphor of the way that this soldier is contextualizing it as this woman that isn't the most faithful, that goes to the highest bidder, and probably saying that because he brought in sellswords, and so he's paying top dollar for these men to sail in from Ireland to fight in these wars. And just like these men, this woman seems to be going to the highest bidder, and she's no friend of Scotland today.
Yeah, so Fortune is portrayed as being a whore because, as Hamlet talks about in Hamlet to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, she changes her affection, so she goes, from one person to the next, and, one person could be filled with fortune and that one person could be misfortunate, and then that could change in a day's time. So it looked like everything was going MacDonald's way until he says, but all's too weak for brave Macbeth. He comes into the scene with probably his gigantic broadsword, as it's talked about.
And this is the second time we're hearing about this main character of the play, right? First time we actually hear him in action.
And he carves through this like you described earlier, as this probably this humanity of bodies, right? And which means probably everybody in his way that's an enemy is getting carved up. Mm-hmm. And he's probably using a broadsword known as a claymore, which was famous for, big generals like Macbeth to use in Scotland. And he carves out everybody, and then he faces the slave, MacDonald, and then he unseams him from the nave to the chops, which is a wonderful kind of spoken decor way of describing that he's been ripped from his belly button all the way up through his rib cage, and the knife or the sword stops on his jawline from the nave to the chops.
Kind of overkill.
He rips him open, and his guts and his entrails just all fall over. And then Duncan says, "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman." And then the sergeant describes another problem happening. What's that?
Well, he interrupts. I see it as them celebrating, but the sergeant is able to get his point out that there's still more to the story. And he says that no sooner did he kill MacDonald and fix his head upon the battlements than the Norwegian or Norwegian?
Norwegian, yeah.
These Norwegian lords, these outside invaders from Norway, these Scandinavian Vikings, came onto the shore and began a fresh assault of men, and a new wave of enemies from the outside begin to launch their attack on Macbeth and Banquo and their forces.
Okay, yeah. So not only was there civil war happening with the merciless MacDonald, but Norway, who maybe they're referring to the king of Norway, but certainly his armies. They take advantage of the weakness or how weak the country has gotten with this civil war. So they decide that they're going to invade from the north. And he said, but the sergeant kind of admits that, it might have turned into a bloodbath, much like Golgotha, which is where Christ died, and supposedly so much blood that there's a comparison there. But he doesn't know what happened. He wasn't able to stick around long enough to see, probably because his gashes are crying for help. And he asked to be taken to go see a surgeon. And then Duncan has him exit and is removed. So they don't know the final outcome of this foreign invasion. But in comes Lennox.
But it does sound like fair is foul here, because they're celebrating this man ripping someone's stomach open. That's pretty foul, but it's fair for them because they're winning the war.
Absolutely, yeah. So I don't think they think twice about the wounds and the gashes and the death on the other side. They just want to stay in business. And then, so I think they recognize that Lennox and Ross, that when Ross enters, he looks kind of strange, like he's seen something bad. So Duncan says, where did you come from, worthy Thane? So here comes that word, Thane. What's your understanding of the meaning of the word Thane in Scottish vocabulary?
It seems like the Scottish equivalent to an English earl or an English duke, which would be they're above a lord. They're a powerful lord that owns the dominion of a good plot of land.
Yeah, I would imagine it's kind of a feudal type thing, even though the Scots weren't as feudal as the Brits. But you would own a certain amount of land that would be attached to that title, I would imagine. And that's your territory, that's your area, that's your province. And so he is Ross is the Thane. His name probably comes from the territory that he is Thane of.
Mm-hmm. Typically, yeah.
And he said that he came from Fife, where Norway himself, as he describes, probably the king of Norway, was assisted by another trader from Scotland, the Thane of Cawdor. And
a lot of traders going around.
Yeah, so he was aided by Scots again, but it looked like thanks to Macbeth, who's described here as Bellona's bridegroom, that the victory fell on them, on the Scots, and they were able to overcome the invasion of Norway. So who's Bellona's bridegroom?
Bellona's the goddess of war, right?
Yep. So the goddess of war shined on Macbeth, and he was successful. Yeah. And so not only was he the winner of the war, the Civil War, but also he was able to.
Yeah, fortune may have been a whore in this case, but then Bellona, which is a more warlike woman in this metaphor, the metaphor these guys are using, these warriors, these crass, there seems to be a crassness too in the way they're speaking, right? Just personifying all of these aspects of war as these different types of maidens and things like that. This one's unfaithful. This one, Bellona. This guy might as well have been her man and all of that. Mm-hmm. Interesting. What do you think that is? Why that choice? Like, why this word choice?
Well, I think Shakespeare likes to use allusions to mythology. When it comes to comparing, people. Like, you don't necessarily have to know who these people are, or who these myths are, or these gods or goddesses, but you just have to know that there's usually a comparison going on between this great mythological figure and a person who's on stage, or a person that will be on stage that they're talking about. So they're basically pumping up Macbeth with all of this, Bellona and fortune and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, right? It's like saying like Wonder Woman's husband, like for them.
So something kind of interesting happens. Ross says, after Duncan says, "Great happiness," Ross says that now Sweno, the Norway's king, craves composition, nor would we deign him burial of his men till he dispersed at St. Combs Inch $10,000 to our general use. So there's usually a ransom involved at the end of a war. And this was kind of during chivalrous times. Instead of killing your prisoners of war, you took them for ransom and you expected money back. So they got $10,000 for their ransom. And I'm sure $10,000 would be worth a lot of money back in those days.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then one thing we learned from Duncan is what's going to happen to the title of Cawdor. Because he was captured, not killed, the Thane of Cawdor. So what's going to happen?
He's going to give it to Macbeth.
But what's he going to do to the current Cawdor?
He's going to execute him.
Yeah.
And strip him of his title and give that one to Macbeth. He's
going to pronounce his present death, and with his former title, greet Macbeth. So we find out, because of Macbeth's effort in these wars, that he's going to be given double the amount of property and title.
Double toil and trouble.
And then Ross says, "I'll see it done." And Duncan says, "What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won." So there's some wonderful imagery in that. And Kamran here actually won an award for a part of this scene where he played.
Yeah, you said that in the beginning.
The bleeding captain, right?
Yeah.
Or the bleeding sergeant, like some people call him.
It depends on the publishing.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the second scene.
Well, it's interesting that he says, "What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won," because that's a throwback to one of the witches' lines in the scene before, where they say that when the battle's lost and won. So now we see this echoic effect going on. Wonder what that's all about.
We will find out.
Act 1, Scene 3.
Scene 3 is a heath near forest. Thunder enter the three witches, and the witches are asking each other where they've been. And the first witch says that she was probably in the country, because Shakespeare grew up in the country, Stratford-upon-Avon, and there was an entire forest named after his mother's side of the family, the Forest of Arden, which is actually in the play As You Like It. So they think that Shakespeare has been greatly influenced by these, stories of, the country life. And one of the stories is if a witch comes to your doorstep and asks for anything, you got to give it to her, or else there's going to be a curse put on you.
Don't they do that in Beauty and the Beast?
No, isn't it? Is it Snow White? Or maybe it is Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah, like that's how he turns into a beast, right?
Okay, yeah.
Huh.
But isn't it also in Cinderella and Snow White?
There's like a witch in Snow White, but I don't think she comes asking for something. But
yeah, it's the stepmother that ends up being the witch, right? Like she's the one that's actually the witch.
Yeah, but I think that it's only Beauty and the Beast where they offer something.
Gotcha. Well, so here's this situation where, this one witch, first witch, she says a sailor's wife had chestnuts in her lap, and it's described that she's eating these things and she's very fat, and she's got a big rump, and but she refuses to give the witch any, and she goes, okay, well, because of that, in a sieve I'll thither sail. So she takes off in a sieve. So what is this sieve that she goes off?
Is it just like a tear in the universe, or like the space-time continuum where like you just can appear in a different part of the world or something?
Yeah, it's I think it is like, what they describe in those like time travel movies it's like a portal. And she says that her husband is master of the tiger, and he's gone to Aleppo, which is, obviously this exotic city
in
Syria that Shakespeare, I'm sure, has no idea about. He's probably only read, Mediterranean stories.
Oh, you don't
it.
think he's been there before?
Oh, no, I don't think so. And he's going to go mess with her husband and her husband's ship because of what's happened by being denied with these chestnuts. And then she comes back with a little surprise, which is a sailor's thumb. So that's what this witch has been doing with her time. And then she says that I can't destroy the ship, but I can at least toss it around and make life really bad for her.
Hey, and I think that's a piece of the puzzle here. I can't not being able to destroy the ship, but make the waves go. She can't force people's hand into doing these acts, but she can change the situation around it to suggest to them that maybe they can do it,
Yeah, so maybe that is a little something about fate, like, that there's only a certain level that she can go to before she can change something that's meant to be. So here she's saying, I can't destroy the ship, but I certainly can make it bad for the people on the ship.
Can't touch free
and
will.
So it might make you question, like early on, like, well, why not? Why can't she just tip top this ship and destroy it?
Well, I think
why is there a limit to her havoc that she can wreak on human beings?
I think it's to isolate these characters from the human characters, or the more naturalistic characters, to put more agency in their lap, because they seem to be more of a choral force that is almost outside of the action of the play sometimes. So maybe they're setting that precedent by saying that.
Okay. And then they hear a drum banging, and I've worked on a couple productions where we make the drums really loud, big jolt to the audience, and it's really fun because it's great to bring those little stage direction things to life. And then they know that Macbeth is coming, and they say, the weird sisters, hand in hand, posters of the sea and land, thus to go about, thrice to thine and thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up 9. Peace, the charms wound up. So they have a charm that they've done. And I wonder what that charm is. Like, what is going to be the purpose of it? So that they can prophesy?
I think whatever comes out of their mouth next must be that charm. And they're just waiting for the string to be pulled for them to say their little thing.
And it says, enter Macbeth and Banquo. And the first line out of Macbeth's mouth is reminiscent of what the witches said at the end of the first scene. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Mm-hmm. So there's that equivocal paradox. Mm-hmm. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. So how can give me an example of why you think his day can be both foul and fair.
It might have been the bloodiest battle he ever fought, but also the greatest success he's ever had on the battlefield.
I'll take it. I love that. Yeah, when I played the part, I tried to justify like, wow, the weather's really bad. Like, look at that weather. God, it's so foul. But what a fair day it was because I'm successful.
I always thought maybe it could be the other way. It's bloody, but man, that is a blue sky.
Yeah, it's. But as an actor, you have to find triggers for things. You know, you have to find ways to find specific motivation to make moments work for you, and that's what I was trying to play with that. So, and then. Banquo notices. Banquo, who is, Macbeth's right-hand man. The first time we see both of these characters, they're together. They work together. They're sergeants in arm, to quote a phrase. And they are on their way to Forest, which is, I guess, where the palace of the king is.
Or the camp that they're going back to. Either way, depending on your edition.
And he sees these women in this weird attire, and they look like they're not of the earth, and they look at him like they can be questioned, and they look old, like old women, but they have beards, so maybe they're not women, but they have skinny lips and skinny long fingers. And Macbeth says, speak if you can, what are you? And the first witch says, all hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis. And what's the Thane of Glamis?
That's Macbeth's title.
Yeah. So that's the original thaneship that he, owns. And then the second witch says, all hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor. And we know about that. We know that he's going to become Cawdor because we heard it from Duncan. Mm-hmm. And then the third witch says, all hail Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter. So here are prophecies made. First of all, they probably surprised the hell out of Macbeth by knowing who he is, and that he's the Thane of Glamis. And then they start making these predictions and prophecy for him, which is you're going to double your fortune by becoming another Thane of Cawdor, and then become king eventually. So
yeah, and there seems something equivocal of how creepy they are and how otherworldly they are, but they're saying nice things at the same time that he'd like to hear.
Yep, and then Banquo notices that he starts. He says, good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair? So I believe that's a stage direction. I believe the actor playing Macbeth has to kind of like move suddenly or have a big expression on his face. You, of course, have to motivate it in a, I guess, realistic acting way. But
do you think they have their weapons drawn during this for defense, like to keep them at arm's length, or do you think that they're sheathed?
I think that's definitely a choice. I mean, do they feel threatened by, something that's supernatural, and how would a sword help if they were? I don't know. Yeah, I think it's a choice. Mm-hmm. But why do you bring that up?
Well, I just wonder if it would raise the stakes if there's that. Obviously, they're probably not going to be harmed by a sword, but how do they know that? And even if they don't know that, it's something they've never seen before, and they just fought a battle where they've probably killed a bunch of people, so they might still be in that warrior mode coming back, for all we know.
Yeah, and things, I think, can be supernatural and yet can be destroyed by physical means, And then Banquo's like, well, you heap all this good fortune on my friend. What about me? What about my hopes? Why don't you give me a little prophecy for me? And the first, what the witches say, hail, 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 lesser than Macbeth and greater. So there's another example.
Yeah. More
How-
equivocation.
Or equivocation. Not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. So all hail Macbeth and Banquo. Banquo and Macbeth all hail. So what is it to get kings? Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none.
It's like beget, but which would mean to be the predecessor of kings. Predecessor, wait, that's not the right word. It would be
Predecessor would mean before, you mean after. To beget.
Yes.
Right? To procreate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to procreate kings.
Like
even
your
though
children's children
You'll never
may
be a
king.
king yourself. Yeah. So equivocation, but the real solid thing they give them is that, well, okay, yeah, you're going to be happy. You're not going to be as happy because you're not going to become king, but you're going to be much happier because, your children are going to be kings, and that might be delightful for you, at some point. So they're still kind of equivocating here, but they give him a definite answer, which I'm sure Macbeth picks up because he's being told that he's going to become king, and all of a sudden, wait, his children are going to become kings too? Uh-oh. Well, what about me being king and my children?
And
Which
he's
then
all
brings up
hailing
a big
both of
question
them.
for later in the play, right?
Yeah.
And then they start to disappear, and Macbeth says, well, I don't know if they start to disappear, but maybe they start to move or they become silent. And Macbeth wants more out of them. Like, how is it possible that I can become the king of Cawdor when the king of Cawdor lives, right? And he charges them. He says, "Speak, I charge you," and then they vanish. And Banquo says, "Wow, the earth hath bubbles as the water has, and these are of them. Whither are they vanished?" And Macbeth says they vanished into the air. So how do you make that happen on stage during Shakespeare's time, the Jacobean period?
Probably the trapdoor under the stage that they were using at the Globe,
Yeah.
I'd imagine.
So during the Jacobean period was the time of King James, and I don't know if we touched upon those notes.
Not really, no.
But yes, this was not an Elizabethan play because Elizabeth died in 1603, and she was the virgin queen who had no heir. So the heir was King James the First, who was actually the nephew of Elizabeth, and he was also currently King James the Sixth of Scotland. And he was a very superstitious person, and supposedly he might have been in the audience in the first performance of this play, and he might have taken offense for some of the things that were actually in the play. Which includes him being a character in the play, which I do believe we will discuss
Yes.
later in the later acts.
And he associated witchcraft as being akin to the Catholic insurgents that attempted his life during the gunpowder plot, right?
Yeah,
At the
attempted
5th of November.
to take his life. Yeah.
And there's something with the Holy Trinity, too, that seems to be parallel with there being three witches, because as far as I'm concerned, the Protestants, they didn't really take very kindly to that. I don't know if sacrament's the right word, but that sort of emphasis that Catholics put on the Holy Trinity.
And then Macbeth, he says that they've gone into the air, and he would wish that they would stay. So how do you create that on stage? How do you make witches disappear?
Yeah.
Or do they really disappear? Is it just a trick that they create themselves? Are these truly supernatural beings, or is it possible that they're just good at magic or pretend,
I think
illusion?
I think that you have a lot of leeway in the fact that there's three that need to disappear, and they don't all need to disappear at once, and you got two guys up there that could upstage the ones that are disappearing. So they're chasing this one, that one jumps down the trapdoor, then Banquo's over here going after this one, and that one goes away. And I think you can be crafty about who's drawing the attention of the audience at any given moment, seeing that you got to get three out of the coop, and you got two guys who could upstage and trick the eye,
Yeah, so as I think we might have mentioned, there was a trap door on the stage that they that actors could disappear into, and that's probably how they make the witches vanish during that time. And then they're kind of joking with each other, and Macbeth says, "Your children shall be kings, and you shall be king, and Thane of Cawdor too, when it not so." And then in comes Ross, who right away says, excuse me, he says that Macbeth, has impressed the king so much with his amazing, sword fighting and courage that he now has won the title of the Thane of Cawdor.
Whoa!
Boom! It comes true, and he says, "Hail, most worthy Thane," Ross and Angus do to Macbeth, and then Banquo says, "What, can the devil speak true?" And Macbeth says, "The Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" And they say, "Yeah, well, he lives right now, but he's going to be executed because he was a traitor, and you now get his title." And they might actually even have like a medallion that they put over his head, which is like a showing of, like jewels or whatever, that shows that he is now not only the Thane of Glamis, but the Thane of Cawdor. And then what else? Macbeth talks aside for the very first time.
Yeah.
He says,
Very important moment.
"Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, the greatest is behind," which actually means the greatest is yet to come.
It's like if there's a procession of a parade, then Glamis is first, then Cawdor, and then
King.
in the very, very background, the block would be king.
And what is meant by this aside? What is an aside? Because it's written actually in brackets, which might mean that maybe Shakespeare didn't write that as a stage direction, but he just kind of assumed that the actors would get that that's what it was.
Shakespeare has a different relationship with asides and soliloquies from play to play. Earlier in the Elizabethan period of his writing, with some of those early histories, a lot of the soliloquies were treated with the fourth wall coming completely down, and the actors themselves were in the space with the groundlings and the audience that they were there with, and the audience was very much the audience, and the character is very much the character speaking to the audience. Think what's going on in Macbeth. This is later in his career. He's playing with this idea of the audience representing the consciousness of Macbeth himself, that he's consorting with, that he's questioning, that he's reflecting and unpacking ideas with. It's this idea of Macbeth's self. And as we start to see in this scene, as he makes these asides, there's this convention also that's set that other stage business, other behavior from other actors, other characters in this play continues or freeze frames while Macbeth in real time is working out his thoughts. And people comment on this, and they say that Macbeth is getting heady, or like, "Oh, look at him, he's lost in his thoughts. Must be because Thane of Cawdor is so new to him." So instead of it being this deal where everyone exudes but one character and now I'm alone, let me talk to you guys, he's creating this different idea, which is I'm spacing out, thinking about all these possibilities.
Yeah, so the other three characters remain on stage while he it starts as an aside, but then it becomes a full-blown soliloquy, and a soliloquy is a monologue that is where the character shares their thoughts with the audience, either directly as in breaking the fourth wall, or just speaking out loud as if they're talking to themselves. It's a convention that's used thousands of times in Shakespeare's plays, and it's one of the great. He's one of the great true inventors, and of that style of acting, where Hamlet, the whole inner life of Hamlet is shared with the audience. All the things that he's thinking get shared because Hamlet speaks a lot of these things out loud, and that's where you can have fun with it, especially if it's a comedy where you can, look into the audience, make eye contact with people, sometimes even enter into the audience. But with a tragedy, it's a little trickier. So you could be talking directly to the audience and making eye contact, but you don't want it to be corny and cutesy, right? Or you just play it, realistically, like the realistic acting of the, turn of the 19th, 20th centuries, where, you're working out these problems out loud to yourself. Okay. So his first soliloquy starts with the words, two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. And then he goes through this thing of like, well, maybe I don't have to do anything to become king, but I'm sure tempted by, murder, that I don't want to think about it, but I'm kind of tempted by this idea that if I act quickly, I could become king. But that's the last thing he says. Come what come may, time and the hour runs through the roughest day. And then Banquo says, we're waiting for you. And he's like, I was forgetting about something, so that's why I was lost in thought. Let's go off and see the king.
What are the two truths? Or he says it can't be bad and it can't be good. So this is what Shakespeare calls antithesis, or not just Shakespeare, but the idea of antithesis is something Shakespeare uses, pitting two ideas against each other. Mm-hmm. So cannot be bad, cannot be good. What is that thought?
This supernatural soliciting cannot be good, cannot be ill, cannot be good. So he's saying, well, it came true, so how could that be bad? But it could possibly be ill because it's tempting me into the dark side, because they've confirmed something to be true that was only a prophecy at first, but now it's been confirmed to be true.
Well, also it seems like his gut reaction here is to think about murdering, right?
Yeah, or just to be tempted so much by a supernatural power that they're dictating to you what's going to be. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure he's very curious about, wait a minute, you said that thing about becoming king. Well, how's that going to happen? Oh, I know how it's going to happen.
I'd have to kill the guy.
I'm going to do something. And that's the part where, the witches are not with him the whole time. He has to kind of make these decisions.
Yeah, they crashed the waves onto his boat, and he leaned into the direction of murder. He went there himself, and maybe the fact that he just went there is news to him. Like, he didn't know he had that within the makeup of who he is before this moment.
And that's where you can question the role of the witches. Are they really supernatural, or are they just, these women that practice this, witchcraft for their own belief system, and that it's part of their belief system to entice people to do things that are, most people would view as maybe sinful or against God, and I don't mean it to sound, in any way, I guess, intolerant of, like a Wiccan religion or anything like that, but this to me feels like it's pure like witchcraft that's based in evil, and that's kind of confirmed a little bit later when they talk about being at the pit of hell and being consulted by Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, later in the play.
Yeah, the root Shakespeare I think uses for witchcraft here tends to be something that appeals to King James and his imagination of the evil that witches commit more than any actual theology.
Yeah, so there's a definite dark side kind of implied from the beginning with the witches. The fact that they're answering to these toads and cats that are their familiars, which they're demons or they're spirits that are guiding them. So. But of course that could be debated, and you could, depending on the director's viewpoint, and I won't talk long about this at all, but I directed a 8-minute version of Macbeth with you that included Lady Macbeth, who we'll find out about in 2 scenes later, that she is somehow infiltrated the world of the witches, and she's trying to get them to work on her husband. It of course veers away from Shakespeare's true vision of what Macbeth the play is, but it's kind of a fun little riff that you can play around with. And I think with Shakespeare you do have I have a friend who does these things. He'll call the play a redux, like Titus Redux or Pericles Redux. So it'll be mostly Shakespeare, but there'll be some kind of new contemporary ideal that's infused into it, even maybe there's a little improvisation or a little changing of the storyline. But it's mostly Shakespeare, but it's a redux. It's kind of a fresher, newer look at the play.
Well, I think that the robustness of these plays that Shakespeare writes is so durable that if you're going to experiment with any writer, it's probably him. Like you could turn this play and that play upside down in a way you probably couldn't with some other writers. Like you're going to take an Ibsen play. I mean, you could probably do something like that too, but not to the extent that you could play around with some of these huge ideas that Shakespeare created.
Well, as we'll find out as we go through the play, the Jacobean audience had a good time with plays that dealt with the supernatural, witches and demons and things. Because it's, you see it in the stage direction that there's dancing and there's music being played. So it kind of augments the theatrical experience. And that's why this play is so popular. Is people just have a field day with it. It's very Halloween-like, and you get just the imagery that you can create, or the starkness, as well. It's a very dark play, so.
Yeah, and I think that's something interesting about when you really get into the weeds of these Shakespeare plays is that conventionally, if we're going to consider genre here, he's not writing in the same way that 21st century drama is, where anything is just straight up drama all the way through, like Mystic River status, or straight up comedy all the way through, where it's like a gaggy, buddy Wedding Crashers thing. He interweaves the two, there's a bit of both. There's comedy in the drama, there's drama in the comedy, and there's dancing here sometimes, and really private moments and really big moments.
And I think the audience would really enjoy it, even though I'm sure they found it terrifying during their time, to have a play played out with witches who are tempting a man to do evil things, and of course, England was a very tumultuous place when this play was written. The gunpowder plot, of 1605 was a year before this play was written. There was a little bit of sense of chaos and subterfuge, things that were going on in the government, and I'm sure that was not lost on the audience.
Act 1, Scene 4.
And at the opening of the scene, King Duncan asks if execution has been done on Cawdor. And as we recall, Cawdor is the traitor who aligned with Norway to overthrow Scotland. And he was foiled and he was caught. And the king, finding that out, takes the title from Cawdor and gives it to Macbeth. But an interesting thing that happens at the start of the scene is that Malcolm is the one that confirms that this has happened, and that the Thane of Cawdor, he admits to what he did and he confesses his treasons. And Malcolm says something kind of clever where he says nothing in his life became him like leaving it.
So that would mean that he died an honorable death? That's the idea?
No, it's him being sarcastic, saying he never performed an act so good in his life as dying. So it's actually a really funny line, believe it or not. And then Duncan says something so, I guess, prescient that really sets up things later, is that he says that there's no art to know what's happening on the inside of a man on his face. And he says he was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust. And trust, I think, becomes a really important theme when it comes to Duncan overall. And then enter Macbeth and Banquo, Ross, and Angus. They're now back in the camp with Duncan. And you got any ideas in mind for this section?
Well, the irony with Duncan saying that there's no art in finding the construction of the mind in the face, in one breath is showing that maybe Duncan's not the best reader of people, but it also harkens back to this convention that Shakespeare established earlier, where Macbeth is going through the motions of walking along with Banquo and these other thanes while thinking about the idea of killing the king. So it might be something that he's already set up in the scene before. And then, of course, we get the irony that the person who's thinking about his death, that he's going to replace Cawdor with, is somebody who's already, as I just said, thinking about his death. So, oh, look, here's a man I can trust. Meanwhile, we've seen what he's been up to all this time, which we've already seen has been happening scene after scene after scene in this first act of the play. One thing gets set up, somebody else is ironically unaware of that, and so on and so on. We saw it with the prophecy with Cawdor, and we're seeing it again.
And we, the audience, are informed, so we know that Macbeth is already, like I said, using the murder word. And then when he sees Macbeth and he sees Banquo, he puts him on this big pedestal and he cries. And Macbeth is very humble in front of the king, and then Duncan is making plans to spend the night somewhere, and it just so happens that the next area of land where Macbeth is Thane, in the area probably of Glamis, which I believe is the castle at Inverness? Yeah. So the castle at Inverness. Is it Inverness now or is it Forres?
They're at Forres currently, and I believe they're going to Inverness.
Okay. So here, they need a place to stay, the whole army. So they're talking about going to Macbeth's house to do that. But first, Duncan, because of all this civil war and invasion, he wants to make sure that his next in line is set up. Like who for sure is going to become king after him. And I guess if you're English, you know the law of, I believe it's called primogeniture, which is your eldest son would reign after you. What's the word for that?
The heir apparent?
Yeah, it would be the heir apparent. But it seems like maybe and I've done a little research on Scottish kings, and I think that's not always 100% guaranteed. So Duncan makes an announcement. Here, after Macbeth has been so valiant and so brave and has won these two big battles that saved the kingdom, Duncan steps forward and says, and now I'm going to give next in line to my son, my eldest son, Malcolm. And I just wonder, do you think Macbeth is expecting him to say him, since you saved the day and you're fourth in line anyway, you're next in line after my two sons, that maybe skip ahead to have Macbeth because he's way more important to Scotland than his two sons?
I think so, because, and when you gave up that little bit of Scottish history, I think it put it into proportion for me, because earlier in the play, in the last scene, when he's in his head, he's saying, oh, maybe I'll be able to be king without even have to think about plotting to murder the king. So come what come may, what's the quote? Time and the hour runs through the roughest day. Is that the correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So there's this sense for Macbeth that we're going to just see how it plays out. I'm not going to think about murder right now. It might just all work out. And I used to think that the Scots were just going by the same thing that English were with giving it to your firstborn son. So I just thought that was weird. Why? What are you waiting for? But if that's the case, then yeah, I absolutely think that that's the case.
Yeah, so some really important things happen here, which is this idea that they're going to be spending the night at Macbeth's castle tonight. And the king is just awarded the heir apparent as king to his son, Malcolm, who so far in the story hasn't really done anything but report a couple of things.
He escaped captivity from the bloody sergeant. So from what we understand, he wasn't even doing that well in the battle.
Yeah, so we're comparing this, probably this very young man, maybe in his teens, to someone like Macbeth, who's described as Bellona's bridegroom, which means he's the husband of the goddess of war, right? And I would just think, having played the role, I felt like, there might be an expectation that I would be the next in line. Like, yeah, you've doubled your ownership of property by becoming not only Thane of Glamis, which is what you were before the war started, and now Thane of Cawdor. So you're twice as powerful as anybody else, aside from the king himself. And now, well, when I pass away, it's going to be rewarded to you, but that does not happen. And of course, you mentioned that he views the Prince of Cumberland, which is the title of
the heir apparent,
which in this case is
Malcolm.
So the Prince of Cumberland is a step. He personifies him as a step in which he must trip over or else overleap. For in my way it lies. And he calls out and he says, "Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires." And then as he goes off to be the harbinger, because he wants to tell his wife, guess who's coming tonight, and to make preparations for the entire army to come to his castle where they're going to party and celebrate the end of the war and the victory of the war. He's going to get a head start on horseback and try to beat everybody there. And before he says that, he says, well, I've got some plans that I got to make and prepare for.
And of course, Duncan thinks he's going so fast because he loves him so much and wants to give him a good sleepover, which goes back to the irony of the beginning of not being able to read people very well and not being able to create the construction of the mind through the face. And we see Duncan once again fail to do that, just as he said in the beginning. So whoever's playing Duncan has a lot to activate as far as that goes.
And the tail end of the scene is Duncan, talking to Banquo, saying, "Yeah, you're right. Macbeth is so truly valiant." But so one of the things that Duncan is emotional about in the scene is not just about Macbeth, but also Banquo's contribution to saving the kingdom. So Banquo is very much part of this, maybe a bit of a triangle going on here. Banquo knows about the prophecy from the witches. And one of the questions is, does he tell Duncan about it right now? No. Why would he do that when he hears, well, also, his kids might become king someday? That too would go against Duncan. And Duncan's just been through civil war and foreign invasion. Why would he want to hear something like that? So I won't say that Banquo is being secretive, because he does talk about being loyal to the king. But I just want to make sure that the audience knows that Duncan definitely values Banquo as well as being a very valiant soldier.
And maybe it's little touches like Banquo keeping those tidbits from the king, which made King James not enjoy this play so much. Because as we begin to see, it's not so much... We'll see, and I don't want to spoil too much. But
yeah, I don't want to spoil it either. But it's funny that something we discussed the other day. I said, what kind of play would this be if Macbeth did the opposite of everything that he did? And maybe one of the things would be is if Banquo and him came into the scene and said, "Hey, we heard from these witches that I'm going to become king, and he's going to have sons that are going to become kings." Of course, they're not going to say anything about that. First of all, it's probably not true in both of their minds. And second of all, it would be treason to probably even bring that up, especially what King Duncan has been through.
Act 1, Scene 5.
Lady Macbeth is reading a letter. So it takes place in Inverness, inside Macbeth's castle. And it's the first time that we get a chance to see this new character who happens to be married to Macbeth.
And in the letter, she's speaking about... She's reading what Macbeth's saying about seeing the witches and everything, right?
Yeah.
So he tells her right away.
Yeah, so he says that he's learned by the Perfect's report that they have more in them than mortal knowledge, which means he's putting faith in their immortality. The fact that they are clairvoyant and they can see into the future and they can prophesy. So they're more than just human beings. So he puts that kind of faith in them. And he hears that he's going to become, Thane of Cawdor, and then he becomes Thane of Cawdor. And then they also say you're going to be king that shall be someday.
Yeah, so I think that what we get from all of this beginning part is that this is a guy who tells his wife everything, and he has a very intimate relationship with her. And I don't know if necessarily every Thane is going to have this relationship. There's other plays where people don't really speak that much with their wives. Brutus doesn't really tell his wife too much. Hotspur, we saw he keeps it close to the chest to a degree where he doesn't really let her in, but the boundaries seem to be a lot looser with Macbeth and Lady Macbeth right off the bat.
And I think it was described by our friend Harold Bloom, who said that it's the most functional and like loving husband-wife relationship in all of Shakespeare, where they are truly partners in crime, and that he truly values what she has to say. And, we're going to find out what those are in later scenes, so I don't want to get ahead. But after she finishes reading this letter, she says, you are Glamis, which is his title. He's the Thane of Glamis. And like we said earlier, a Thane is an earl, the equivalent of an earl in royalty. And then she's now accepting, and you're Cawdor, so you have two titles, and shalt be what thou art promised. But then she immediately jumps into this, but I fear your nature. It's too kind. It's too full of the milk of human kindness.
And that's why I think that there's something interesting about Macbeth as a good protagonist that seems opposite from what you were saying before. Because it's been established right off the bat that, if he's filled with the milk of human kindness, maybe there's a natural benevolence to this guy that is deeper than just being an average Joe who now has a chance to kill the king.
And it's very interesting that she says that he's too full of the milk of human kindness, because as we find out in this, even later in this scene and in later scenes between the two of them, she brings up breasts and breast milk and, femininity at least, 3 or 4 times. And I think Freud would have a field day with Lady Macbeth, and I'm sure that he did, because, I don't know, we're kind of looking at a classic example, as we'll see, of a woman who, maybe suffers from what Freud would call penis envy. She envies having that kind of strength to be a man, to do these kind of mercurial things like kill another man in order to get what you want.
Do you get the vibe that there's a mommy type relationship with her and Macbeth?
I think if there is, I'm not sure that there's a play.
Yeah.
Like,
in what way?
if he suffers from some sort of, mother complex, and I've seen it played that way. I'm not sure if it's the Orson Welles version that kind of hints at her having like this really strong upper hand, and I think that could play to a degree, but I like that Harold Bloom approach, which is, these are two people working very dynamically together.
They're on equal footing.
Yeah. Even though she doesn't know the battlefield, she does have a certain level of guile, and she does say for anybody who's confused about, this is probably one of the most difficult monologues to comprehend. And I think I finally kind of get it now that I've, read it and been part of productions of it for many years. Is it okay to just kind of read this part?
Sure.
Glamis thou art and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised. Yet do I fear thy nature, it is too full of the milk of human kindness, to catch the nearest way. And, most people are not going to know what that means unless they look it up in a good edition, right? What does that mean to you, to catch the nearest way?
I'd say like the fastest train to success.
Yeah.
Almost.
You're too kind to go for it right away and just kill this guy and get what you want. That's catching the nearest way.
So
right?
maybe there's some word choice there. You're saying that she's aware that nearest way. So the immediacy of having it now is important to her in a way that it might not be for Macbeth.
And for people first reading this and not knowing the story and knowing the background of the relationship and seeing it evolve right there in front of them, they probably don't have enough information on her to know what the hell she means by catching the nearest way. She then goes on to say, thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, and a very important word because we talk about the fatal flaw that every protagonist has one. And I think most people will agree that it's ambition that is the downfall of Macbeth.
Definitely in this case, yeah.
But without the illness should attend it. What thou wouldst highly, thou wouldst thou holily, wouldst not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. Thou'st have great gloms, that which thou must do, if thou have it, and that which rather dost fear to do than wishes should be undone. I mean, I've seen people just act like they know what they're saying when they say that.
That part is tricky.
That is tricky.
What thou wouldst highly, thou wouldst holily. I'm going to give you my guess at what I think that is, and you jump down my throat and correct me. So what he values is something of a high virtue is a holy virtue to him. So his priority for being the best and being your best self means to be in a pious realm, being in a doting realm to God, to be good to God. That's what he prioritizes. Is that what she's saying?
Maybe. I think it's that, this thing that you want, you have to view it as being a holy act if you're going to kill him, Like you're trying to allow guilt and things to get in the way when a deed so strong like this is the killing of a king. You have to look at it with just you're righteous in doing it. That's going to be your way to get it. It's the nearest. You're going to catch the nearest way. And but if you want something that highly, because again she says, "What thou wouldst highly, that wouldst thou holily." So highly, it's kind of antithesis where highly is pitted against holily, right? You want something of a high thing, you have to view it in a holy way.
Oh, I thought it was you want something high, but you're going about it as a pious person who's respecting the order of the king and all of that, and not willing to commit regicide.
Yeah, but she's giving him advice without him actually being there, and she says the illness should attend it, but without the illness should attend it. What thou wouldst highly, thou wouldst thou holily, would not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. And then she says, thou wouldst have great gloms, that which thou cries, thus thou must do, if thou have it, and that which rather thou dost fear to do, than wishes should be undone. Hie thee hither, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valor of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have thee crowned withal. So even though she knows he's going to doubt the action of catching the nearest way, she can't wait for him to be there so that she can pour this kind of, what does she call it? Chastise that I might pour my spirits in thine ear. This idea of like, my ill spirits, my evil spirits, I want to be able to pour that in your ear. And what she means by using ear is that I've got words to tell you, but they're going to come out like liquid into your ear because it's going to be an overwhelming amount of stuff.
Yeah, and as we've seen in Hamlet, people pour poison in people's ears sometimes. So maybe there's some sort of a metaphor there where she's going to put poison into his being to corrupt this goodness of Macbeth and curdle that milk of the human kindness.
And then, as you said, a messenger enters and says that the king is coming to the castle tonight, which was not part of the plan. That was not in the letter that Macbeth sent to Lady Macbeth. He only sent the letter about, hey, we came across these witches after the war, Banquo and I, and they hailed me as Thane of Cawdor, and then hailed that king that shall be, and I became king of Cawdor. Thane of Cawdor, and it came true. And so she's like, oh my God, that's great. So that means you're going to become king. But there's no mention of, the king coming. That's a separate letter that Macbeth probably would have written if he had the time. But instead, as we know from the earlier scene, the scene right before this, he gets on his horse and he books it to her. Yeah. But somehow he must have told another messenger, hey, go ahead of me and get this message.
Yeah, while he's at the drinking fountain real fast.
Yeah. So when she hears that, she goes nutty, okay? She says that the raven himself is hoarse, that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements, and says, come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here. Okay, so she's saying, maybe the spirits she's talking to are the witches. Maybe she's aware that they are some sort of metaphysical thing. And
which brings me to this question, which is, what do you think is the physical action going on here? Because there's a lot of words here. You could read it as some sort of anti-prayer or a curse or hex. But what do you think is the strongest choice for the actress to physically do here?
And I will defer to, is it Dame...
Judi Dench?
Dame Judi Dench, you know.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because years ago when you were in my Shakespeare class, as a senior in high school, I showed like 3 different versions of Macbeth, and one was just a really bare bones version that was directed, I believe, by Trevor Nunn, and it was like a black box production. And it was very famous. It got a lot of attention, and they did it on videotape. And it's Ian McKellen and Judi Dench. So how can you go wrong? I mean, they're just they're such amazing actors.
That was a really good one.
Yeah.
It's my favorite.
And then I showed the Patrick Stewart one that has a lot of production values, and then the Roman Polanski one, because historically, well, it was the first film that Polanski made after his wife was butchered by the Manson family, and the child ripped out of her, and he used that kind of as it was a metaphor for his own personal life, that Macduff is pulled. Well, I don't want to spoil.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have a second to talk about that for sure.
But there are parallels to Polanski's life and what happened to him, the horrific tragedy that he suffered, and the play Macbeth.
But Judi Dench, from what I recall, she was on the ground, right? And she was touching the earth, right?
Yeah, and she was, you could just tell it was whatever realm or mode she was going into seemed very forbidden. Mm-hmm. Like it's kind of like this idea that if this is a Christian play and it's taking place during, medieval times, when Scotland, went from being a pagan,
Gaelic?
Well, they were.
Was it
Gaelic? Maybe Celt. Maybe they were Celts, and that they believed in. But they were unified by Christianity, and to intentionally go against Christianity, that kind of is what that moment is to me when I see Judi Dench, because she has a head covering that makes it look like she lives in a religious time or religious place, like a theocracy. Mm-hmm. And when you see Duncan in that production,
he's in all white.
Yeah, he's very holy. He's like a pope-like figure, So yeah, it's. I think that's kind of the approach, is that she's going into this very forbidden realm and calling upon the dark spirits to help her in her cause.
To take her milk for gall, unsex her, and create this transformation in her where femininity, which is looked at as having the virtues of mercy and the soft and gentle qualities of human nature, she's looking to exterminate that. And we see it in what examples? What
Absolutely.
are some things she says?
Yeah, so she says, "Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers. Where in your sightless substances you wait on nature's mischief. Come, thick night, and pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife see not the wound it makes, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold." So it's kind of interesting. She creates almost like a childlike thing there, where she's peeping through a blanket to see, God's, wrath, and she's asking for that not to happen. I don't want to have to peek through the blanket to have guilty feelings about what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. I want to go 100% forward.
It's a lot like stars hide your fire, so that, et cetera, dark and black desires, they both seem to have this thing going on with wanting to numb themselves or blind themselves to whatever they're about to do, so that way they could do what needs to be done really fast.
And of course, here's the second time where she talks about, women's breasts and, milk. So it's the second mention of, within 2 or 3 minutes of seeing this character, it's the second time she's talking about breast milk. Very interesting. Which I know we're going to pause a little bit and not try to talk about.
But we're planting a couple of seeds.
Until later.
Yeah.
And then Macbeth enters, and she puts him on this big pedestal. And he says very little. He says, "My dearest love, Duncan comes here tonight." And she says, "And when goes hence, tomorrow as he purposes." And then she says, "Oh, never shall sun that morrow see." And then she notices something about his face.
Yeah.
What is it?
She says that your face reads like a book where men could read strange things. So what that means is that Macbeth doesn't have a poker face, and she could see right then and there that the idea of killing Duncan must unfix his hair and make his heart knock at his ribs, which he said before.
Yeah, so she says to him, to beguile the time, and some people may not get what that is unless you look it up in the glossary of your edition. To beguile means to trick, right? To beguile the time, look like the time. So the time meaning all the army, Scottish army with the king coming to our house in order to trick, them into not thinking that anything's wrong. You have to look very innocent, right? You have to look very, very innocent. So that's what I think is meant by beguiling the time, right? Trick the time, trick the people.
So I think that what she's basically saying there is like, let's just get this party going. I'll make that roast pig, and you'll drink the sherry, bring out the nice cigars, and just play it safe and leave the rest to me.
Yeah, and she's like, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent
under
it. So
it.
she uses this snake metaphor. And then she says at the end, he says, we'll talk about it more. She goes, but yeah, just try to leave everything to me. I can handle this.
Do you think they're about to have sex after the scene's over?
One production with Patrick Stewart, that's kind of, they're trying to be kind of sexy, but to be honest, it's kind of gross because he's so gosh darn old. And God bless him, because he's a wonderful actor, Patrick Stewart. But, he chooses to be opposite a woman who is at least 20 years younger than him, if not maybe 25. And, that today, it's, Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart, those guys used to be able to get away with it back in the 40s and 50s, or I would say 50s, I recently saw Cary Grant in a movie, and he was wonderful, and he is still he's a very sexy, star, but it is, you can tell there's a big age difference, and audiences, that was more of a convention they'd go along with it in the old days. But
you still see it today. Bradley Cooper has a lot of young ingenue types that are like in their 20s and he's in his 40s. But with Patrick Stewart, he's pretty dang old by this point. So that probably reads a bit different than Bradley Cooper.
And I think if you're going to do that, if you're going to have that difference in age, then you need to really make that be part of the story, Mm-hmm. That he is being seduced by her at all times that they're together. Like there's just some strong hold that she has on him that's probably based in her age and her sexuality.
Say he was a little bit younger. Do you think they're about to have sex?
There's just no time.
Because they're at the gates.
Yeah.
That's something good to play with as the actor too. If you don't get that ejection button to press, and you just have to go through all of this with that cloud in your brain.
I mean, it almost feels like she's seductive toward him, and I would imagine I won't say that it's actual sex, but she's probably doing seductive things during this whole little "oh never shall sun that morrow see," right? I mean, and I did play opposite my own wife in my own life, and she really played that moment very enticing, But at the end of it, she kind of cuts him off and like, come on, let's go. We got some work to do.
Coitus interruptus.
Yeah, no, she has total work to do. Prepare the house. She just heard that the king is coming. Thank God Macbeth is an experienced soldier and writer, and I'm sure he's booking it probably at twice the speed as everyone else, So.
Well, let's see how it plays out.
Act 1, Scene 6.
Yeah, if this was a movie, I'd see this scene as the gates open up. all these royal, regal horses riding through, trumpets going off, all the standards flying, and coming into the middle of this castle, which, what do you think is, because the scene has a lot of spoken decor, as you said, about them looking around at this campus of Inverness Castle. So what do you think this castle's like?
So they talk, it's very ironic that Duncan says, this castle hath a pleasant seat. To think that inside this castle right now, they're plotting murder against the king. And the king himself, first thing out of his mouth is, wow, this is such a welcoming, inviting place. And Banquo agreeing with him and saying, yeah, look at how procreant it is.
Yeah, look at that bird over there.
Yeah, look at those martlets. Like martlets are, I guess, a bird that they have in England. I'm not sure if we have them in the United States. We might. I don't think we have them here in Southern California. But there's these martlets that are nesting in the juddies and friezes of the, I guess that's like the drainage system of the castle. And they feel like it's so beautiful and delicate, and it says the air is delicate. Very interesting.
These are tender birds that only prop themselves in places that are very peaceful.
Yes.
Banquo says.
And then Lady Macbeth enters.
She comes in and Duncan is kissing her hand and is just so happy to see her and saying how he's going to set Macbeth up, and thank you so much for putting us up. And she's just saying that this is nothing. If you times this by 10, then that wouldn't even come close to how much you did for us just now with this big promotion, going around saying, where's Thane of Cawdor? Where's this? He's breaking the robes in for him, so to speak, calling him Thane of Cawdor so much.
Yeah, and probably part of it is just an excuse for, we would do so much more for you if we had a little notice. And of course, she's not guilting him on that. It's just, we're going to do everything we can, but it's going to pale in comparison to what we would normally be capable of. So it's almost a qualification, I think, in a way.
Because she's cooking something. She's like, oh, this is just something I throw together. If I had more time.
I can imagine it could be as many as hundreds of people. Because if it's the whole army of Scotland and they're traveling with the king and people are going back to their homes after the battle, obviously it seems to me like Macbeth's castle is the closest. That's why they're stopping at his castle to spend the night, for everyone to rest up. And as we find out later,
not everybody is there. We do know
but as we find out later, the king is actually staying the night inside the castle, and someone comes to get the king the next day very early in the morning to get on the road again. So travel is definitely a kind of a motif here. This idea of travel.
The nearest way.
Yeah.
This is a transient part of the play.
And then Duncan notices that, where's the Thane of Cawdor? This guy who I just, gave this new title to. He rides so well, it's like he just booked it and we couldn't keep up with him. And so it's kind of interesting that Lady Macbeth says she says, leave all the rest to me. And here she didn't even bring him to the door with her. Probably because of that look on his face, that he needs some practice, maybe in front of a mirror, trying to take that look off of his face.
Go take a bath, put your good clothes on, and just reflect for a second. Take a couple deep breaths.
Yep. And then at the tail end of it, Duncan's like, well, give me your hand, and we're going to, we can't wait to see him again in his own place, and we're going to heap, compliments on him, and we'll have a wonderful feast.
Yeah, and they bust out the champagne, and the party begins. Act 1, Scene 7.
So this is the last scene of the act. And for Shakespeare aficionados and Macbeth aficionados, this is a very meaty scene.
Steve was just saying it's like the to be or not to be of Macbeth. And we'll see why in a sec. We've got this big old soliloquy. And where the soliloquy, got a little tongue-tied there, comes is in the middle of this banquet that they're having. Macbeth leaves the dining hall, goes off to some other vestibule, some other hallway of the castle, and he's alone with his thoughts, and this soliloquy comes out.
And it's funny because in acting, that's such an important concept. The given circumstances. The given circumstances here is that he has just partied with the king and everybody's praising him left and right. And, he's probably exhausted from just the day, because he started off the day saying, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. And I think it's still during that day. If you want to talk about the unities of time, place, and action, we're at least led to believe that it's still the same day. And he's been through all these things. And so now he has like a quiet time, like where he can get away from other people, which he kind of tried to do earlier. We heard some of his private thoughts in soliloquy or aside. And now this is a big one because this is a big 2-minute speech, very famous.
Yeah, and I think what might be bringing it on is the fact that all day people are saying that they love him, the king saying that he loves him. He said it to the wife a couple times, he said it before. He says, we love him well to Lady Macbeth, and I'm sure everybody, as he says later, is giving him their golden opinion, and that must be a level of praise that Macbeth has never got before and must be pricking him on to say some of the things he says.
So I think what we should do is we should cover, since it's not dialogue and it's just a monologue, I think we're going to try to cover it section by section, whereas in acting they call it beat by beat, right? So let me just read, and when I think that the beat changes, I'll probably stop, okay? So here's the beginning of the speech. And also you might note how I say the lines, because I'm going to try to stick to the iambic pentameter, even though I think it's really difficult to do so. And so maybe Kamran can comment on that a little bit, okay? If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence, and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all, here, but here upon this bank and shoal of time, we'll jump the life to come.
So in that beat, he is mapping out in his head if he rhetorically, if he hyperbolically, hypothetically, if he hypothetically, not hyperbolically, did this act, and just what if nothing ever had to happen that was bad? What if everything all of the fears, and as this piece of work that Steve showed me said, it's, what do you call this work?
The Variorum?
Yeah, we were reading this Variorum, which is it's an index of opinions, and what somebody wrote was the idea that all of the anxieties and troubles and fears that Macbeth has die with the killing of Duncan. Is there anything else you'd like to specify with that?
Literally, beat? That word "done" is so important. If it were done when 'tis done. So if by doing this one blow of killing the king, like just taking him out, if that's all I needed to do and I could get away with it, I would do it. Right? I would do it. If just this one blow might be the be-all and the end-all, I would risk the rest of time, which is eternity, which is maybe he's referring to damnation in his soul, that in order to become king in this bank and shoal of time, which is a very short amount of time, because a shoal is, a little cove, like off of a sea or an ocean, and it's just a little parcel of land, compared to like the entire earth and the ocean. So he's referring to being king within this bank and shoal of time. He's going to jump the life to come if he knows he could get away with it. So to him, becoming king is more important than his soul going to heaven.
And we don't need to go into this too much, but just an alternative reading, and you could take the way Steve's saying this bit or mine, whichever way sounds more sound to you. But I almost feel, and we've gone back and forth about this, that the "but here upon this bank and shoal of time" might be where the intention shifts, because in the middle of saying, if killing Duncan would just take everything up, we'd be fine. And then to say, but here upon this bank and shoal of time, this sliver of this life, we jump the life to come. We'd risk going to heaven. We'd risk what happens in the afterlife. And that might be the beginning, an early beginning of this next beat, where Macbeth starts to spiral and look at the risks of what happens next.
And so the next beat is, but in these cases we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. And then he gives reasons. He says, he's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. So he's saying, well, this is not a case where you could just kill someone and get away with it. This is a case that's going to be examined because he's the king. He's the king of Scotland. We just went through war. If all of a sudden he dies, people are going to question him dying and why this happened. And if I'm found out, the justice that I meted out on him will be meted out on me when people realize I'm the killer.
Yeah, so far he's realized two things: that he's going to risk his seat in the afterlife. That's one con as to why not to kill Duncan. The next con is that somebody could kill him as well. And as we'll see now, it looks like Macbeth almost has this Venn diagram where he's looking at the benefits of why he would or would not. And right now we're seeing a lot on the con side right now. What's the next thing with the double trust?
Yeah, when he talks about his double trust is that, he's his kinsman and his subject. So kinsman meaning they're related by blood, and subject is that he is subject to the king, not vice versa. He's not over the king is over him, and that's the natural law. That's the God-given law, that you obey the king and it's godly to do so. So that's, he's here in double trust. Yeah, he's my kinsman and he's my king. So I shouldn't kill him.
That's a selfless reason not to kill someone, though. At least with the other one, with the judgment here and bringing the chalice to your own lips, there's some self-preservation there of, but I might be caught, I might be killed. This next reason as why not to do it is, it comes from a much more empathetic, selfless place. Because if he was this guy who would just be fine killing willy-nilly to get to the next step, why would something like being the subject of a man really be enough to mire someone down unless they really did respect this order and this hierarchy and had some treatment of it with love and respect?
Well, you could see maybe why he wouldn't have respect maybe for the king, because they just finished war. They were at war with not one but two enemies. One was a civil war, the other was someone from the country getting somebody from another country, Norway, to overthrow. And so even though Macbeth says, wow, everybody loves him so much, a little bit later in the speech, there must be some doubt about this guy, Duncan. That already he's been challenged, 2 times, like on the same day in war. And yet the guy that saved the day is now thinking about doing it again. So what is it part of Duncan's character that even though he's loved and respected, that people would feel they could put one over on him? It's kind of an interesting... Yeah. Duncan is an interesting character. He's probably only has about 30 lines, maybe 40 lines. And He's not in the play that much, so we really don't know that much about him except what people say about him.
But don't you think that might have more to do with the world of Scotland itself that Shakespeare creates? When we'll see later by the very end of the play, there's a lot of interpretations that hint that this is a cyclical cycle, that now there'll be...
Cyclical cycle?
A cycle that's cyclical.
Okay.
Everyone, a cycle...
That's cyclical.
That's cyclical means that it's going to go in circles.
It goes round, right?
But do you know what I mean, though? Maybe it doesn't have to do as much with Duncan as it does with the nature of the beast in this country being at war. There's always going to be someone who's going to connive and stab someone in the back.
Correct. I think that's correct. I've kind of ditched it, but I have this historical book on Macbeth that supposedly gives you the actual story. And of course, it's over 1,000 years ago, so I believe it was in the 11th century.
Yeah.
And, and it's so long ago that there was not a lot of factual information that was extant through the years. And so there's a lot of speculation about how government was ran. And one of the things was, we talked about what I say, I might mispronounce it, primogeniture or primogeniture, which is that the king is handed, the king hands down to his oldest son, and he hands down to his oldest son, and so on and so forth. That has changed in England. It's no longer based on gender anymore, so whoever is the oldest is the...
Heir apparent.
We said heir apparent, but that...
You don't think that's the word?
Well, what's the other word?
Successor?
Yeah, successor.
Okay.
The true successor, the heir apparent, is supposed to go that way. Now, in Scotland, I don't think it was set up that way. Sometimes things were kind of a battle as to who should be next in line. And again, like we said, Macbeth maybe feels like he's deserving of it. Mm-hmm. Even though he loves and respects Duncan, which I'm going to read right now. So here's another idea that he comes with.
Okay.
And we talked about enjambment, which I'm not sure I have a real clear meaning about, but it's just that, to me, it's like there's all these kind of side points, he's trying to kind of get to this one main point, but besides, and this, and that, so I think he's finding all of these things as he's deliberating. Mm-hmm. This is very much the to be or not to be speech, right?
Yeah, it has a lot of twists and turns. As Steve said, the verse is kind of funky, and I think that's a reflection for the character that he's having a tough time unpacking this.
So it says, besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, like in the Bible, the meek shall inherit the earth, hath been so clear in his great office that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. So, the heavens themselves, you'll hear the trumpets from angels if they're aware that Duncan is going to be killed, right? That's how meek this guy is. That's how well he's borne his faculties. And pity, like a naked newborn babe, striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim, horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind.
Describe this image.
I just think it's the heavens are going to cry out, and every ear and eye is going to be open to such a great man, being unjustly killed.
What about tears drowning the wind? Do you think there's like a biblical flood?
So the experience Macbeth will get if he kills Duncan, this is of course what he's projecting, and he's right. He should listen to himself. He should definitely pay attention to his own advice in this scene, and then it wouldn't be a tragedy. But he projects that people are going to be crying so bad, right, that tears will drown in the wind. The wind will be full of tears, that if you're walking through the wind, you'll be drowned like it's a big rain, and you won't be able to come up for air. That's how many tears on earth there will be for this great holy man, as he's described. And I think he's juxtaposing himself in that image, which is, here I will be king at that time because I'm next in line or whatever, but I will be witnessing how they really feel for this guy, and they're certainly not going to feel, happy that, oh wow, Macbeth's going to save us and now he's king. They're not going to be like, oh yeah, hooray, Macbeth is finally king, that great hero. They're going to be so sad about Duncan that it's going to overwhelm any idea that it's a great thing that Macbeth is now king.
Yeah, I think that as well, with the addition that God and his whole legion of angels will come looking for justice for whoever did this, which would be the king. And I just think the imagination for him to come up with that is, he has such a flowery, vivid imagination, but it comes from this God-fearing place he seems to really fear the wrath of God in a way that I don't think is matched by many Shakespeare characters. And I feel like this is a big part of what makes Macbeth a remarkable, tragic protagonist in a Shakespeare play, is that he may not be I don't think he's the smartest Shakespeare character. I think what makes him compelling are these details of how he comes to grips with sin. And it seems like he just feels these things in a visceral way that's different. And maybe that's not to say that he's more pious and good-natured than anyone, but he certainly feels things very deeply, and it has a deep sensitivity. I don't think that goes hand in hand with being a good person, but he's definitely sensitive.
And for those of us that know the play, this is kind of an early foreshadowing of, maybe some of the guilt that he may later feel if he goes through with this deed. I don't know, this goes back to something that we might have said earlier that I said to Kamran about, if he had just done the opposite throughout the play, like if he instead of, listening to Lady Macbeth at the end of the scene, if he really listened to himself, he's got it. He knows, like, that he's got great instincts. And unfortunately, what is it about Macbeth that he doesn't just follow those instincts all the way to home? And it's because of this, which is that goes right to the spirit and the essence of his character. He says it right here at the end of the speech. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. And this edition that I'm reading from right now is not a good edition, because it should have and falls on the other and then a dash.
Gets cut off
because
by
his thought gets cut off because Lady Macbeth enters. Because what he's about to say is that I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other side. So the word side is missing there. It's I guess an analogy he's making. Maybe it's a known analogy that if your ambition is too great, when you go to saddle a horse, you vault, like you jump up on it. Like a vaulting really is like that idea of like planting the 2 feet and then jumping, right? So he's vaulting so much that it's too much that it goes on the other side. So he's personifying ambition, because he talks about, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, right?
That's interesting.
So he creates these wonderful, Shakespeare creates these wonderful, metaphors here, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, right? So it's referring to like him as almost as the horse, but then he kind of changes it as if he's the one then going on the horse.
Yeah, it's not the clearest.
And he can't do it because he's too strong. that idea of ambition, which is now personified,
But-
goes over the horse.
But which one is it? Because in one metaphor, he's on a horse with spurs, and you'd imagine that he needs the spurs to prick the horse on. And then the very next part, it's the metaphor, it changes to him jumping on a horse.
Yeah, in one image, he is the horse, and in the next image, he's the rider of the horse. Yeah, but it all leads to his ambition is so great that he needs to kind of curtail it.
And that's not the first time we hear him talking about jumping over to the next place in this speech. He says it before, so.
Then, of course, and that's really just such a delicious, soliloquy. It has everything. It has all of his humanity. It has his sense of sympathy for, our empathy for Duncan. It also has the fact that he's a schemer and ambitious. It has all the complexities of the character really in one soliloquy, and it's really amazing. And again, I just wish he would just listen to himself. And of course, then Lady Macbeth enters, and then what happens?
So she comes in from the party, and she's asking him why he left the table, and he's getting flustered and saying, "Oh, did he ask about me?" And they have this shared line they have going back and forth really fast, where she's like, "Don't you know he did? He has asked," and it goes back and forth, and he stays resolved, and he says, "We will proceed no further in this business." Looks like she's about to say something, so he says, "He hath honored me of late, and I have won golden opinion from all sorts of people, which should be worn now in their newest gloss, not cast aside so soon."
Yeah, and then there's a long pause, or she picks it up, right? And you can tell in Shakespearean verse where if a line is a short line and the next character's line is a short line, you could either say that they immediately pick up the line,
Or you tab it to the end.
or you count to 10 syllables, and then there's a pause of that length in between, right? And then she says, "Were you drunk when you promised to me? Okay, if you're going to be like that, then I'm going to count your love that way, that you're wishy-washy with me." And she said that if I had promised so much as you have done, oh wait, that's a little later.
That's a little later.
So she says, "Wouldst thou have that which thou esteemest the ornament of life, and live a coward in thine own esteem, letting I dare not, wait upon I would, like the poor cat in the adage." And when I teach this to high school students, seniors in high school, they don't even know what the word adage means, so they don't get the reference here, right? Adage, which is a saying, a saying that people are aware of,
It's like a little fable, Humpty Dumpty.
Yeah, or what's some of our what are the well-known adages of our time? Like all's well that ends well, or
One in the hand, two in the bush? Or is that just an idiom? What's the difference between an adage and an idiom?
For me, like an adage, well, it's a saying. And I think you're right. It's a small little morality tale, right? And this
Pandora's box.
The cat in the adage is the cat that wants to eat the fish, but as we know, cats are kind of finicky and they don't like water very much. And so they want the fish really bad, but they're not willing to get their
I don't
paw
want to get wet.
Yeah. And so she's saying, are you just like that cat in the adage? You want to become king really, really badly, but you're not willing to get your hands wet, i.e., blood on your hands, which is a really important image. So, especially for later.
Especially when you compare water and blood, which seems to always happen in this play, and you see it first here.
Yeah, and when she calls him a coward, he then sticks up for himself and he says, "I dare do all that may become a man who dares do more as none." So he's like, well, I do as much as any man on earth. I'm coward. How can you call me a coward? I just won the war, twice. So how am I a coward? And then she says, well, what beast was it that made you break this enterprise? And then she says that, if I had promised like you had, right? I would rather take a baby who's, again, here's the imagery again, that's sucking, on her breast for breast milk. She would rather take that baby and dash its brains out before she would break a promise like he's broken to her.
That's funny. I always thought that she was saying, if I promise to kill the baby, I do it.
No, I don't think that's correct.
Oh, I thought she was talking about the importance of an oath. Like, say I made an oath to do that, I just do it. If you said to do.
Yeah. So she says, I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out, had I so sworn as you have done to this.
Had I so sworn. If I swore to kill the baby like that, I would have done it, just like you would have with Duncan right now. But you don't think so. Your interpretation is instead.
Well, my interpretation is that if I had made a promise to that degree, before I would break a promise like that, I would take an innocent child that I love, that normally is, breastfeeding, and I would kill it before I would break a promise like that. Mm-hmm. So it's a comparison between the two things,
Ultimately boiling down to her being very
that's one of the worst
this.
things you could ever do is kill an innocent child, a baby. Mm-hmm. But she's saying, but I would do that before I would break a promise like you're breaking right now.
Mm-hmm. And of course we come to that moment. She admits she's given suck before. Yeah. Which gets to the quintessential dynamic of the relationship between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth.
I guess the question at this point is, in the dramatis personae, there's no mention of a child or an heir. There's no baby or whatever. So where is this baby that she's given suck to? That's the speculation. What is the dynamic of this relationship if they don't have children? What's the dynamic of the relationship if they do? Would it change things? Mm-hmm. And what's the speculation of the baby itself? Was it their baby? What are your thoughts on that? Is it their baby? Was it baby from another relationship? Is it possible that maybe one of my theories is that maybe she was a low-class citizen who was a nursemaid to another, woman's child prior to meeting Macbeth?
Yeah, there's a bunch of theories that people have. The one that I had for the longest time was that they had this baby, and it was very common, especially not just in Shakespeare's time, but if not just in Shakespeare's time, definitely in the 11th century, that babies wouldn't make it past the next couple of years and would die in their cribs, and that was relatively common in those days. So I thought for a while it might have been their former baby, and in that way I think it would really inform Macbeth wanting to go to the ends of the earth to make this woman happy, knowing that he can't produce a child for her. So at the very least, maybe that's what she's going to use as the ace in the hole to get him to go on and kill Duncan. But I heard this theory that I also found really interesting that feels strong in its own right, that what if Lady Macbeth was married before to a different man and had a baby with him, and it's Macbeth who can't bring children into this world. He's the one who's infertile, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, that's always going to be an open wound for Lady Macbeth to lean into, something that's always going to make him feel like he's not on equal footing with Lady Macbeth and make him pliable in certain arguments. I don't know which. I think either one. Each one has something to play with. I think either works. But ultimately what happens in this scene is that there's a power struggle where Lady Macbeth has a lot of leverage. I'm not saying she has so much more than Macbeth, because he does hold his ground and it is ultimately up to him. But there's something at play that has to do with the child that Lady Macbeth uses against Macbeth. And I think as long as you find that, that's the important part.
So again, it comes back to this theme of what he proposes in the very first line of the scene in the soliloquy. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. He says to her, if we should fail, and depending on the edition, this edition says we fail ! Well, some have a question mark.
We fail?
We fail? With me in charge? We fail? That's like an impossibility. So I think there's a couple of different interpretations that you can have there. She says, if you screw your courage to the sticking place, we'll not fail. And then she gives the plot. So we So this is probably something maybe he's hearing for the first time in great detail. And of course the audience as well, which is Duncan will be asleep and we're going to drug the two chamberlains, his guards. We're going to put something, what is it?
Gonna drug their...
It's a
their
drug,
liquor.
it's like a drug that they put in their wine, their wassail. And so they're going to think they've had a glass of wine before going to bed, when in essence, she's drugged them almost so much that it's almost ready to kill them. It says, a limbeck only, when in swinish sleep, their drenched natures lie as in a death. What cannot you and I perform upon the unguarded Duncan? What not put upon his spongy officers who shall bear the guilt of our great quell? So not only that, but they're going to frame the two guards as well, right? Because then he says, bring forth men and children only.
Yeah.
So the way she's acting, is that whole unsex me here kind of theme, which she talked about earlier,
Yeah.
And he's noticing the masculinity in her now.
Like, you're gonna pop out these guys with these big old red beards. If
Yeah,
anything.
I'm kind of wondering, maybe in Macbeth's mind, he still thinks it's possible that they could have children. I mean, maybe the relationship is kind of a new thing. Maybe they've only been married for a certain amount of time. And maybe the first child they had might have died. And there's still a hope. That's why he says, bring forth men and children only. Because he's aware that she could still bring forth children.
Or what if there's a poetry to him saying that because you might not be able to have kids, but you're able to bring birth to these ghastly and inhuman, or these barbaric ideas. Because she is the mother of this plot, so to speak. So maybe you don't have kids, but you have this plan.
Yeah,
it's
for
pretty
thy
great.
undaunted metal, and metal is mettle, which is what composes a person, what they're made up of. It can compose nothing but males. And then he asks one very important question. Will it not be received when we have marked with blood those sleepy two of his own chamber and used their very daggers that they have done it? And she says, who dares receive it otherwise? We shall make our griefs and clamor roar upon his death. We're going to act when, we're so sad. We're so devastated by the death of the king. Oh my God. Everybody has to believe it, right? And then he says, I am settled and bend up each corporal agent to this terrible feat. Away and mock the time with fairest show. False face must hide, what the false heart doth know.
Hey, which is it's a callback to what Duncan said.
Yeah,
about
it's hard to know the
to make up the art of
what
is it?
The art in a man's face.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny because now most people interpret this play as, Lady Macbeth talks him into killing Duncan. So can we address that? Do you think that's what happened?
No, because one thing that he says, no matter how much he is against the plot, he says at the end of his speech that he has no spur to prick the sides of his intent. He never says he has no intent. That's the thing. The intent is there. That's a tell. That says that this is something that no matter how much Macbeth fears God, this is something he wants. And he just needs the right spur. And that's Lady Macbeth. And I think there's something poetic to that being the line that she walks in on. Because,
And so for me, I don't agree with anybody who says, Lady Macbeth talks him into it. Okay? When he is first given the thainship of Cawdor, he has an aside and he says, the greatest is behind. I'm planning to become king. I can't wait to pursue this endeavor. Maybe I don't have to do anything and it'll just happen, but he kind of starts talking himself into that murder needs to happen in order. So he's been plotting it on his own. Then he sees Lady Macbeth. He sees that she agrees. That definitely spurs him on. But then he has second thoughts because he's a good man. It goes back to, he's a hero and the protagonist having, a fatal flaw, but he's naturally good. So I think that is a really important thing. And I think what Lady Macbeth does is she proves to him that he will get away with it, which is that whole, if it were done when 'tis done, or if it were done when 'tis done, that he will be able to get away with it. She convinces him that you'll be able to get away with it. She doesn't completely change his mind. She just supports the idea that, you know, the whole plot is all set up, and all you got to do is just kill the king, and we're going to get away with this.
Mm-hmm. So then it almost makes everything that he felt about why he shouldn't do it come more out of a place of fear than a place of love and empathy. So in that way, I kind of see what you were saying earlier with Macbeth, that you don't think he's the most redeemable as far as having a big heart or anything like that, or loving Duncan that much. Maybe, I think that's a good point that maybe Shakespeare's playing with this character is the virtue of being merciful and loyal. Does that just only come out of fear? Is there anything more, like if all bets were off and we were left to our devices, would anyone really be good, or would they all just be going out for what they want? And
that's a good point.
To hell with loving one another and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe he despises. Well, I mean, he would say that if given the chance to say how he truly feels about Duncan and how Duncan rules. You know, if he has an issue with Duncan, he would say it. He would say it in the soliloquy, and he doesn't. He's loyal maybe to a fault. He doesn't say, God, this old fool who got tricked twice earlier, you know, who's given me like the Thane of Cawdor and coming to my home when like I'm even plotting against him, when, you know, most people would think I wouldn't do that. You know, I don't know, maybe it almost feels like there's something that he has against Duncan that makes him want to do it. But to be really honest, it's just that ambition thing. If we were to try to look more into the play, we would be at an impasse. We would hit probably a dead end. Yeah. You know, because it's there. What people say is who they are.
Yeah. I wouldn't look too far into the Duncan thing either. Yeah. It's the bottom line is it's a good king that he wants to kill for this, and he's afraid to do it because he's afraid to get caught, but it's not because he resents the guy.
But if I were an objective person and the witches didn't come to me and say, oh, you're going to become king, but I got a chance to think it out on my own, I might decide, hey, now that there's war is over and we're going to return to a certain kind of government, maybe we should work at getting rid of this Duncan guy because he's not good for the country because he's too trusting of people. He's gullible. So these kind of things come back to what I talk about, the tragic flaw, which I don't think it just relates to the protagonist. I think it relates to people that die in the play and what's the reason for it. And I don't know, this Duncan guy isn't... I mean, are we going to see him again, Cameron? Can you make a prediction?
Probably not, but maybe. Who knows?
We probably only saw him in those 3 scenes, right? He's in 1.2, he's in 1.3, and he's in 1.6, right?
Right.
Isn't that right?
I don't know. So you're saying he's not in 2.5?
He's not in the first. The witches are in the first because here we are at the end of Act 1, right? So he's not in 1.1, but he's in 1.2, and he says, what bloody man is that, right? Oh, so he's not in 1.3, because that's Macbeth and the witches in Banquo. He's in 1.4, and then Lady Macbeth is 1.5, and then we see him again in 1.6, entering the castle at Inverness. And that's it. He's only in it 3 scenes. And, you know, in my mind, he's somebody that should be ousted. And, you know, it's funny, because historically, he supposedly was a bad king. And it was kind of like the Magna Carta and King John, that the members of royalty had really little faith in him because he was actually kind of tyrannical too.
But when you look at the other characters in this play, they're all pretty patriotic.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with it, is that I think their brand of patriotism is to respect the
monarchy.
Yeah.
Like that is it's, you know, you recognize it as, I mean, even today, people with Donald Trump, they think, you know, he's been put in there by God. You know, people say, well, if it's God's will, if a person is in this position, it must have been God's will.
He's Scottish.
To think that this day and age, people could believe that. Well, they firmly believed that back in the day. You know?
It was a reality for them for sure. I just think that everyone needs to be a patriot for Macbeth's descent into treason to really read. But yeah, we covered a lot in this scene.
So this is the end of Act 1, people. We really thank you for sticking with us, because we know it's probably about 2 hours playing time, and you know, I hope you benefited from some of the themes that were brought up and the plot points and the analysis, and well, I mean, hopefully you realize that we pointed out the complexity of Shakespeare's writing and the levels and the depth of it. You know, one of the greatest plays of all time.